Hello, and welcome to The Limits of Our Language, a podcast about digital writing across the curriculum for teachers who believe in the need for development of multiliteracies inside and outside of the classroom. I'm Darcy Flansburgh. Hey everybody, welcome to the podcast. The last time I had a podcast, I was talking about STEM writing strategies in your classrooms. And I realized that a lot of the Writing Across the Curriculum podcasts that I've listened to and articles I've read are always coming from English teachers. So I decided instead to interview some teachers who are not English teachers to get their experiences of writing in their classrooms. And so today we're going to be talking to Mr. Habib Ulhaq, who's a science teacher at the international school that I teach at as well in China. And he has done some writing in his classes, and I wanted to get his experience with that. Full disclosure, he's also my husband, but his interest in writing is not just because of me. So I first let's just meet Mr. Ulhaq and hear a little bit about his background.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome. Welcome to the podcast.
Very nice.
So tell me a little bit about your background. How did you end up in China?
Well, I initially came to China with the idea that I would teach English as a second language just to get my bearings in international waters. But speaking with some experts on international teaching, they advised me to focus on science, as that was my background. I have a degree in genetics, and so I got my teaching credentials in science and was lucky enough to find a very, very nice international school where I also met my wife.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I've been teaching for 4 years at this school, and
tell them what subjects you teach.
I teach chemistry for grade 10, grade 11 physics, grade 12 environmental science, and I'll also teach a different AP science subject every year. So I've taught AP chemistry and AP biology over the past 4 years.
Yeah. So I was also wanted to ask you about when you were, your background in genetics, when you were taking science classes, was writing part of your science program either in high school or in university?
I mean, high school and university were very different in terms of how writing was applied. The way it was applied in high school is probably very similar to what I'm expected to do, at least at the bare minimum level, what I'm expected to teach at the moment. In university, writing was usually in essay form, so it was an assessment of your learning more than anything else. You were expected to write coherently in an academic format, and normally an essay of about 3,000 words upwards.
And just to clarify, also, you went to university in the UK.
Yes,
so,
I'm from the UK.
So it was very focused. The UK educational system, university system, is very much just focused on your major, right?
That's right. We don't have the general ed first year that the American universities do. So I pretty much went in knowing what my degree would be at the end. Well, since I teach AP, in AP chemistry and biology, they are expected to be able to write free response answers to the question, free response solutions rather. That involves a certain amount, maybe a paragraph at most. Usually a lot of the questions are single lines, and obviously they need to be able to show literacy in calculations. So if you're going to, for example, give a mathematical solution, it needs to be written out in a coherent fashion. In terms of writing itself, that's what I'm required to do. They need to be able to write out full sentences and, in some cases, paragraphs. But usually, writing is not used for anything more than assessment. So they can take notes, and a lot of the time, especially before I really got into using writing in other ways, that's what it was used for. We would use it just simply to assess their knowledge. Do you understand this topic or not?
So when you say using writing in other ways, how do you add writing in other ways to your class?
Do you know? Have you ever heard of the blog Farnham Street?
I think so, but
I'm a little obsessed with Farnham Street. So Farnham Street is a blog that talks about Shane Parrish runs it, and he talks about mental models and different ways of thinking and improving your ability to be a lifelong learner, essentially. And he tweeted something a while back. He said, "Writing is the process by which you slowly realize that you do not understand what you were talking about."
Mm-hmm.
And I tested this on my students a few years ago, where I finished giving what I thought was a fantastic lecture on thermodynamics. And
we always think it's fantastic.
I thought it was so good. I thought it was so clever. I had all these analogies, and I was making jokes throughout the whole thing, and they were laughing, and they were engaged, and visually I thought, okay, they understand what we're talking about here. I even gave them a mini quiz, and they got all the right answers on the multiple choice. There's no problem. Then I asked them each to close their books and write a paragraph about what they learned today. And it was a disaster. It was horrifying. And it's nothing against them. It's what I realized, it was all on me. I realized that what I thought they understood, they didn't understand. And the other thing that it was a fantastic learning experience for me and an amazing way for me to give feedback to them. Because although I immediately had the desire to correct them and say, so for example, some of the problems that they had was when they were writing the paragraph, they would not know how to use the definitions of words. So they would have a term and they wouldn't know how to use it, even though they had shown in a multiple choice that they knew which one of these choices the correct definition was.
Right.
They did not know how to use it in a paragraph where they had to apply it. And other situations where they did not know how to link all of these ideas to something that was relevant to them in their day-to-day lives. And so what I realized was, as I was ready to correct them and tell them what to think and give them the right answers, I realized that if I simply pointed at the places where work needed to be done on their paragraph, it gave them an opportunity to think about the specific gaps that they had in their own knowledge. And this is what I think this tweet is about. It's that if you ever feel like you know something, try to write a page on it.
Right.
And you will really see where the gaps in your knowledge are. There's this other problem that I came across, which I'm vulnerable to this fallacy all the time, which is when when you read something, and it's the second or third time you've read it, and the familiarity of it, because you read these sentences before, you can confuse the familiarity of it with the idea that you know it. So you will think that you understand it simply because it's familiar to you.
Right.
And I've fallen for this so many times, so how can I expect my teenage students not to fall for this? And it happens. You'll ask them a question like, do you understand? And they will probably very honestly tell you, yes, they understand.
Yeah.
It's only
because they think they do.
Absolutely.
They think they understand.
They think they understand, and we all fall for this.
But as you're saying, like in AP, we have the multiple choice sections. I teach AP language and composition, but I'm very wary of just giving multiple choice tests, largely because I have had students in the 10 years that I've been teaching the course that are just really good guessers. Like they just visually identify something, or they notice patterns, or they recognize the type of question and can find the correct answer. But if you ask them why the answer is correct, they can't tell you. You know? So when you've had, and I know we've talked about this before, but when you have students who clearly do well on a quiz, but they can't explain it in writing, do you ever have them go back to the question and look at the question and say, can you justify why this answer is correct?
Absolutely. That's mostly what the feedback for AP practice entails in my classroom now. If for example, we'll have it used to be simply that I would have them do the questions that they got wrong. So I'd have them do 20 to 30 questions, and then any question that they got wrong, they had to give me a rationale for the correct answer once they had found it. But I actually found that it is equally useful to simply give them fewer questions and then have them rationalize their answers for each one.
Right, yeah.
And it just what happens is that their conversations become more grounded in the concepts that I'm trying to have them deal with. Because what I noticed was that almost every time we had a situation where we were trying to produce knowledge from the concepts that we had learned, there was a lot of evasiveness and a lot of silence in those moments. And they were sort of waiting for my cue about what to talk about. And this basically came down to the fact that they did not have a strong base in the knowledge, and they hadn't internalized it.
Right.
Even though they could potentially produce by rote, so they could say what they had read.
Right.
And being in China, there is a very strong culture of rote learning here, which honestly, in my opinion, is not a bad thing.
Right.
I don't think there's anything wrong with rote learning. I think automaticity has a place, especially in subjects that have a lot of heft to them, like chemistry and biology. A lot of names to learn, a lot of concepts that you have to really internalize before you can get to the critical thinking stage. And I honestly think that that stuff is kind of, how you'd say, it's not given credit. Rote learning should still be an important part of your classroom.
There has to be a kind of a blending of memorization meets critical thinking.
There needs to be a balance.
Yeah.
And each classroom is going to find that balance in a different place. And you as a teacher, it's your role to find that balance. But dismissing it, I think, is always a mistake. Because a certain amount of automated thinking, of memorization, is vital to any progress that these students are going to make in their thinking, especially if you want them to start thinking for themselves.
Right.
I mean, in particular, for writing, scientists have a very particular way of writing, very dry, very academic, very objective, and I've been teaching that to my students from grade 10 onwards. We start with how to find good sources, and then how to write in an objective manner that doesn't involve your own ways of thinking, or rather than, not your ways of thinking, it doesn't involve your own feelings,
right.
or
so
your own opinions.
Objective writing.
As objective as possible. But it is still extremely useful to allow them freedom when it's not assessed, especially, to give formative feedback on activities that require them to use their own opinions, to talk about what they think a term means, because it gives you such valuable information into their thinking. And more often than not, they will learn better, and they will gain a sense of competency from their own learning. They will see that once I've got it written down, it's not like shuffling around in my head. It's frozen here, and I can build on it, or I can break it up, and I can put it back together. And I think this is where the skill of writing is so important, and it is, I mean, in my class, for sure, it was something that they had to learn. How do I look at a piece of writing? How do I actually write an essay down in a way where I can follow all of Mr. Ulhaq's directions, where it needs to be objective, and it needs to have the concepts and the arguments need to be linked in a certain way. And a lot of the time, I kind of just stole stuff from you, because
because it works in every subject. That's the thing, and that's why it's always been frustrating for me as an English teacher, because I've had so many teachers who will make these same kind of comments, like, oh, my students aren't really internalizing it. And I'm just thinking, well, if you had them reflect in writing, they'd probably really take a moment to actually internalize it, as opposed to, this is just something external to me and I have to learn it and then I move on. But when you, like you said, you have them take a test and they do well, but if they can't explain it, then you go back to that cyclical scaffolding of information, right? Let's go back and review and see what you really remember and applying it. And I feel like writing is always the best application, because that's where you can, just as you were mentioning with that quote, that's where you can really see what people fully understand. Because we'll have students who they could probably get away with, and doing a few lower order thinking activities, but once you have them do some kind of constructive response, that's where you see all the holes, and that's where you see that they're not making those connections. So when you've done some writing in your classes and you have them do this rationalizing and multiple choice, are there any types of writing that you would like to do in your class that you haven't done yet? Like, is there something that you, or something you'd like to do more of?
I would definitely like to do more reflective writing. This was part of my This was part of my master's program, which I'm still completing, which was looking into action research and reflective writing and reflective journaling. And again, it kind of comes back to they need to practice writing in contexts where the students are not used to practicing. So a lot of them come into my class not expecting to use what they learned in your class in my class.
Right.
And it takes them a little bit of time, some more than others, to really get into the groove of this is the same thing.
Right.
It's just that we're now applying it to a different
subject.
Yeah. Maybe a slightly different paradigm of thinking. And once they get rolling with that, I think the reflective writing is really useful because science can be frustrating. It can be really frustrating to put a lot of energy into something and not see immediate results, especially when you're trying to learn a subject that maybe you don't have all of the prerequisite skills. Maybe your math skills are not on point, or maybe, just like a lot of our Chinese students, maybe you just haven't had a lot of experience with critical thinking. And the new standards, or rather the new American NGSS standards, they're very, very hyper-focused on critical thinking and process-oriented problem solving and projects, and it's very, very different to what a lot of students have come to expect from a science class. It's a lot less rigid, and I think the writing gives a very personalized and very anxiety-free, in many cases, an anxiety-free platform for them to be able to organize their thinking and to organize their work. Because it's not just a matter of writing essays about the subject, it's also about planning. So what am I going to do tomorrow? How am I going to complete this homework in the time that Mr. Ulhaq gave me? In some cases, the more spirited students, especially the ones who are really well organized, they will challenge me on assignments that I've given, and they'll ask me, so you're expecting us to write this much in this much time. I don't feel like that's enough time. And we can break that down through writing, because it's really hard to have a conversation about something like that just through words. We actually have to look at our schedules, and sometimes they're right because of their other commitments or other commitments to other classes. It's difficult for them to complete the work, so I'll have to work around that and give them maybe an extra day or lower the workload. And all of that stuff gives them a sense of autonomy in my class, and I think that's really, really important. And the writing is where they can really show me what they've understood. Right. And what I try to do is I try to give them as much writing as possible that I don't grade, but I give them feedback for. Right. Rather than, because it's really weird, especially when I was in college, all of the assessments were written. We had essays from 3,000 words onwards. I don't know how many pages that is, because Americans do pages and I don't.
No, it's just or English. In English classes, we do MLA format, and that's based on pages. Other subjects do word count.
Oh, that's my ignorance then. I don't know anything outside of my subject.
That's okay.
So, so everything we did was all of our assessments were written components, essays mostly, and if you wanted to learn how to write the essays, you had to go to these separate workshops that were outside of your class experience.
So like a writing workshop, not a writing tutor center.
No. It's like a writing workshop, okay. Exactly. It was part of our career center, so you would have to go between classes, or sometimes you had classes when they were running the workshops. They were very good in trying to make it, but it always felt psychologically to me like a periphery. It was something that was happening on the side, but really what you wanted to do was be in the classes. But one of the greatest physicists in recent history, Richard Feynman, he did all of his thinking through writing. There was a story about how a journalist came to him and was in his office looking over his notes, and he had a really messy office, just strewn with notes and pages everywhere. And he was flicking through one of his notes, and the journalist says to Dr. Feynman, "It's so great that you have written down all of your thinking, so that the rest of us can benefit from it." And Feynman turned to him and said, "No. I haven't written down my thinking. that is my thinking. He did all of his thinking through writing, and he wrote beautifully about this.
Didn't you do some activity or something with your students that was something Feynman-esque? I remember you talking about it.
So through this, I developed I developed this mini program in my class where if they wish, they can do it this way. They don't have to, but a lot of them are seeing the benefits of it, which is that I've started having them take notes in this manner, whereby all of my lectures, anything that I want to transmit to them is as much as possible in video format, so they can take their time with it. My classes are quite self-paced. It allows I believe, the best form of differentiation, which is some people are just take longer to learn the same concepts as others do. So they can go through the videos, and the idea is that they develop notes that are in their own voice. And after they've watched something, they got to pause, and they got to write down what they know. Not while the video is going on.
Right.
Because that allows you to parrot. That allows you to skip over the parts that you don't understand and just fill them with the jargon that you're hearing, or fill them with the exact words. And this is, again, this is not something that only students do. All of us do this.
Yeah.
We're really, really bad at just stopping and thinking about what we actually understand. Our brains just tend to fill it in with vocabulary and assume that's enough.
Right.
And the more I made them do this, the more I started noticing the thinking of my different students, and I started noticing I had gotten them wrong. The ones that I thought were really understanding things, turned out they had massive gaps in their knowledge. Gaps from maybe 2 units ago. Like, I'd like to rephrase that. Not massive gaps in their knowledge, crucial gaps in their knowledge. There would be a crucial concept that they had not grasped, and they had simply overlayered it or overcompensated with a vocabulary word that they didn't really understand. And it was brutal for some of them to do this. It was really painful because they had to stutter and stop and think, and for the first time I can really say that they were really like sweating it out and thinking about the minutia. One of the problems that I feel that came out of this was that it kind of forces you to look at the totality of your own knowledge, and it can be very overwhelming. So I've realized that I definitely need more scaffolding rather than just having, okay, go. It's probably better to start with, say, really small videos, like maybe a minute, and then have them pause and then write, and then pause, rather than what I had them do the first time, which was watch like a 4-minute video and then have them write everything out. That was really painful for them. But once they got through it, I can say that a fair few of them came up to me and said, okay, so I now know what I don't know.
Right.
And I think that is the most valuable thing writing can teach you. It can teach you what you don't know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so what you're talking about kind of reminds me of Cornell Notes, which is what I have my students do. And the thing is that, like, we'll take notes together, so them copying my notes is fine. But at the end of the notes, they have to summarize it in their own words.
Yeah.
So it's not a matter of them just copying the notes and then saying, oh yeah, I took the notes, therefore I understand. But they have to go back and look at their notes and then summarize it. And I think that's the most important part. And it's their least favorite part. I got to the point where I told my students, if you don't summarize your notes, you get no points for the notes.
I think what's great about that is with Cornell Notes, you're scaffolding. You're giving them something to build upon rather than just the blank page of terror, which unfortunately is what I started with. I gave them a blank page and I told them just write whatever you can think of. And I think that comes back to what your job, which is teaching them how to write, and what should be my job as well.
Right.
Is that it's not just about how beneficial writing is. We all know, like, the research is clear on how helpful writing can be for any activity of gaining knowledge, but it's about knowing how to write as well. Another one of Shane Parrish's tweets that I read recently in preparation for this podcast was, writing a long email is easy. Writing a short email is hard. Again,
Yeah.
it's the skill of writing, of
Brevity is the soul of wit.
brevity,
Yeah.
of being writing something for somebody else to read is something that I think I'm really starting to focus more on this year, especially, which is, if they're going to write something, I tell them, write for somebody else, even if that somebody else is you 1 week from now. You should be writing for an audience. Writing is always a public act, even if you're writing just for yourself. Your private diary is meant to be read. So you should be writing it so that you, 15 years from now, will understand it. And that requires a little bit of thinking. It requires practice, first and foremost. And I think this is where a lot of teachers sort of falter, is even if they get past the hurdle of, why should I write in mathematics? Why should I have my kids writing in, insert subject here? It's something that you have to learn. You have to learn how to teach writing. It's not something that comes naturally to everybody.
But I think that's also a common misconception. Like, when I say writing across the curriculum, all the other subject teachers are like, that's not what I do. And it's like, well, I'm not telling you to write an essay in your class. I'm saying, like, write at the end of their notes, have them write a paragraph about what they just learned, like what you're talking about. It's not to say that they have to do this massive research paper, even though honestly that should be done in every class, and that's a lot of what my website is about. But they do need to think about writing as what my website is called, Write to Learn. It's a way to test and reflect their learning. And it's not, and the thing is, like you said previously, you don't have to actually grade it. You could just have it as a process. Okay, now reflect on what you just learned.
I think, in fact, I would go further than that. I would say you should not grade it. You shouldn't grade the writing unless it is assessed, a piece of assessment. The problem is that I noticed, even the way I was teaching, just, the first year that I came to China, was that I wasn't teaching them how to write. I was simply expecting them to write what they knew.
Right.
But it's two different things. You could have something in your head and not be able to write it down in a clear, succinct way. I have students that have these problems where if I ask them to say it through, an inefficient form of speech, they will explain to me that they understand it, but they will not be able to write it in a way that even they themselves would find useful if they were to forget all of this knowledge in a month and come back to it through their own notes.
So in that sense, then there might have to be some kind of, and that's where also, like, as a teacher, I like to provide models of, or some kind of example or exemplar of what I'm expecting them to do, because when they see, like, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do, then it's not just a blank piece of paper that they're having to fill in, or starting with sentence stems. But there's so many resources for these things that I feel like teachers kind of, again, non-English teachers, look at it as like this big task, when really, like, students write, especially now, our students write all the time. They text message all the time, right? You could even tell, like, I've seen silly activities where they have to tweet about what they just read,
Right.
Like, there's all these things that can be more like fun, reflective activities that don't have to be this massive thing where the teachers feel like, well, now I have to grade it and I'm not a writing teacher. It's like, but you don't have to be. You could just the act of having them write is enough to get them to really internalize the content that you want them to internalize. It's not about the writing, it's about the content.
Well, speaking of internalizing, I think this is where we need to consider, so I'm a content teacher, right? In my subject, content is king. It's about all the different topics, all the big ideas, all of these concepts that create the world known as chemistry or physics or environmental science, and its terms and its arguments and its phenomenon and all of these things that come together to form the subject. And while the current standards are emphasizing the importance of skills, critical thinking, the standardized tests like AP, they still have you learn all of that content. And so there's definitely a slight incompatibility there right now. And I think, hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll find a balance there. But in terms of teaching writing, I don't deny that it is a tough thing to do as a content teacher. It is an extra thing that I have to do. It is one more thing. That's how it can be perceived anyway. But if you do it, what I found is that it actually lessens your workload in the future. It's a front-loaded skill that once you have gained the basic proficiency in, your students will have more autonomy, they will have more control over their own learning, they will have a better metacognitive understanding of where they stand. So they will be able to see what they don't understand because they have to write it down.
Right.
And they're not falling for the fallacies of their own minds telling them that familiar is the same thing as knowing.
Yeah.
Just because I know the word photosynthesis does not mean I understand what photosynthesis is. And when I have to write down a short paragraph on what photosynthesis is, and I get stuck, my teacher can come up to me, circle the place where he goes, this area is weak. What do you think you can do to change it? I can question my students rather than throwing solutions at them.
Right.
And I can force them to sit down and think about it. And when they get that answer by themselves, it creates a flywheel effect where, okay, I got that. What's next?
Right.
What do I need to understand next in this paragraph? And it becomes something that they're building for themselves. And they're proud of it by the end.
Right.
So to me, it's not that I'm adding this extra workload onto my system. It's that I'm making my workload more efficient by doing this.
Yeah.
I'm adding a skill that once I provide it through the activities to my students begin to become self-learners. And what else is our job except to make them self-learners?
Yeah, well, especially now, I mean, we're talking about, like, you know, memorization meets critical thinking. And a lot of people will say memorization isn't as important now because of the internet. But honestly,
I disagree.
Right, and that could be a whole other conversation, but our students need to know how to take information and then use it, right?
Even memorization requires writing.
Right.
Flashcards or, you know, anything that you do. I tend to, when I'm trying to learn something, I tend to use a software that allows you to fold the text into a headline.
Right.
So that once the headline is there, I try to remember everything that's going to be unfolded.
Right.
And then I unfold it and I check.
Yeah.
And it is a way faster way
That's
to
actually
learn.
how you're supposed to use Cornell Notes.
Well,
if you
there
do
it is.
if you do it on paper, you're supposed to, like, fold the paper so that you can study and then read the answers and then review the summary. It's actually really effective.
So then I've been taught Cornell Notes wrong because I've never heard that before.
Yeah, that's what it's, I mean, like, you and I both use a lot of technology, so doing stuff on paper isn't always our go-to, but back when I taught in California, and we were an avid school that used Cornell Notes in every class. We were expected to have them, like, on paper, and they would fold them and then circle and highlight, and it was very proactive and interactive, and that's
really cool.
And Cornell Notes is another, like, again, easy writing across the curriculum tool, and there are so many different ways to do it. You can use those foldable methods, but for me, it's just a matter of them having the notes, and then they look at the questions and don't look at the answers, and then they have to answer the questions without looking at the answers, and then at the end they write this summary.
Have you had them do this in our school?
I've had them do components of it, but I'm not because my class is not a content-driven class, it's a skill-driven class. It's more about showing them how to analyze a text and then being able to summarize or paraphrase or quote the text appropriately.
Can I ask you to find some way to try this?
Yeah,
Because I think it would be really cool.
But I think that if all of us, like, if you in science and you know, our history teacher, our math teacher, if we were all using Cornell Notes, I guarantee all of our students would, first of all, they'd complain at first because they're like, oh, Cornell Notes, because it's work, right? But once they're all doing it, it becomes just this routine. And then you realize, like, if everyone's doing it, we're not having to tell them, like, this is how you do my notes. It's like, no, we're all doing this style of notes, and then it becomes this way to memorize content, and yeah, so they're really, really useful. But I'm sure we could go on and on. We usually do. We talk a lot about work, and we love talking about our students and our classes and our content, but I think this is a good place to stop for today, and thank you for sharing your ideas, and maybe next time we come on, we can maybe talk about science fair and how when you do science fair in a couple months, how writing will be involved in that process.
I would like that very much.
Okay, cool. Well,
Would
thank you.
you like to have lunch now?
Lunch is a good idea.
Okay.
I think that sounds good.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Ulhaq.
Thank you, Ms. Lansbury.
Okay, bye. This has been The Limits of Our Language. Join us next time for more ideas about how to bring writing to learn into your classroom. See you then.